As the meeting wound down and people began to gather in small groups to talk, Michael looked around the room with a sense of quiet amazement. The incident that could have left him bitter had instead opened doors for real change. Andy's innocent trust in human kindness had sparked something bigger than any of them. Outside, the winter stars twinkled above the community center. People lingered in the parking lot, exchanging contact information and making plans for future meetings. Andy showed his space dinosaur drawings to anyone who would look, while his father and Michael talked with community members about next steps. The story that began with a lost boy and a butterfly had transformed into something much more meaningful, a reminder that change is possible, that understanding can grow from misunderstanding, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply help someone in need, even when we know it might be misunderstood. As Michael drove home that night, he smiled thinking about how a single moment of kindness, despite all the challenges it brought, had created ripples of change that would continue long after that autumn afternoon in Cedar Park. Sometimes the best stories don't end, they just become new beginnings. 3 months had passed since that fateful day in Cedar Park. The winter chill had settled over the city, but inside the community center, warmth and chatter filled the air. Michael stood at the front of a packed room, still somewhat amazed at how one afternoon had led to this moment. The viral video of the park incident had sparked something in their community. What could have remained a single unfortunate event had instead become a catalyst for change. Tonight was the first meeting of a new community initiative, Building Bridges, focused on breaking down prejudices and fostering understanding between different groups in their neighborhood. Mr. Wilson stood next to Michael at the podium, looking out at the diverse crowd. There were parents from Andy's school, local business owners, teenagers, elderly couples, and families of all backgrounds. Even Officer Thompson and Officer Lopez had come to show their support. "I never expected to be standing here," Mr. Wilson began, his voice carrying across the quiet room. 3 months ago, I was the person who needed this program the most. I was the one who looked at a kind stranger helping my lost son and saw only my own fears and prejudices." He paused, looking at Michael with respect before continuing. "But sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best changes. My son Andy taught me that. He saw what I couldn't that day, just a good person helping someone in need." Michael stepped forward to share his part of the story. "When I found Andy in the park that day, I almost walked away. Not because I wanted to, but because I knew what might happen, how people might react. But then I thought about what that would teach him, that in his moment of need, people chose to walk past rather than help." The crowd listened intently as Michael continued. "This isn't just about that one day in the park. It's about all the times people hesitate to help others because they're afraid of how they'll be seen. It's about the assumptions we make before we know someone's story." In the back of the room, Andy sat with Ms. Rebecca, drawing something in his notebook. He'd grown a bit taller in the past months, but his fascination with dinosaurs hadn't changed. Neither had his way of seeing people for who they were, not what they looked like. "The real change," Mr. Wilson added, "happens in small moments. It happens when we choose to see each other as human beings first, when we teach our children through our actions, not just our words." A local teacher raised her hand to share how she used their story to talk with her students about prejudice and kindness. A teenager spoke about starting a lunch buddy program at his high school to help kids who usually sat alone. An elderly man described how the incident had reminded him of similar experiences in his youth and how he hoped things were finally starting to change. As the meeting continued, people shared their own stories of times they'd faced prejudice or times they'd recognized their own biases. The atmosphere was honest but hopeful, challenging but supportive. This wasn't about shame or blame, it was about growth and understanding. Near the end of the evening, Michael shared some exciting news. "Remember Andy's space dinosaur idea?" he smiled. "Well, my company loved it. We're developing an educational game called Cosmic Explorers that teaches kids about both space and prehistoric life." And the main character? A friendly park ranger who helps lost space explorers find their way home. The room filled with warm laughter and applause. Andy beamed from his seat, holding up his latest drawing of what appeared to be a stegosaurus floating among the stars. "But the best part," Michael continued, "isn't just the game. It's that we're partnering with local schools to use it as part of a larger program about helping others and overcoming prejudices. Sometimes the best lessons come wrapped in unexpected packages or wearing space helmets. Mr. Wilson stepped forward one last time. Before we end tonight, I want to share something my son said recently. He asked me, "Dad, remember when you were scared of Mr. Michael? Why aren't you scared anymore?" And I told him the truth, that I learned to see with my heart instead of my fears. He thought about it for a moment and said, "That's good, because fears can lie, but hearts know when someone is kind." The afternoon light filtered through the coffee shop windows, casting warm patterns on their table. Two men from different worlds, brought together by a lost child and a butterfly, sitting together not as adversaries, but as two human beings trying to understand each other better. "Change is possible," Michael said, finishing his tea. "It happens one conversation at a time, one realization at a time. What matters is that we're willing to have these conversations, even when they're uncomfortable." As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Mr. Wilson reached into his bag. "Andy wanted me to give you this," he said, pulling out a folded piece of paper. It was a child's drawing of a dinosaur floating among stars, wearing what appeared to be a space helmet. At the bottom, in crooked children's handwriting, it said, "Thank you, Mr. Michael." Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments: a lost boy, a kind stranger, a butterfly, and the courage to face our own prejudices. As Michael carefully folded the drawing and put it in his pocket, he knew that this story was far from over. It was just the beginning of something much bigger than any of them had imagined that afternoon in Cedar Park. A week had passed since the incident at Cedar Park. Michael sat in the corner of a local coffee shop, a steaming cup of green tea in front of him. He'd arrived early for his meeting with Mr. Wilson, wanting time to gather his thoughts. The events of that Saturday afternoon had sparked conversations far beyond what he could have imagined. His phone buzzed with another notification. Someone else had shared the local news story about what happened. A teenage girl had been recording a dance video in the park that day and caught part of the confrontation on camera. The clip had gone viral, but not for the reasons most videos do. Instead, it had become a starting point for important discussions about prejudice and the fear of helping others. The bell above the coffee shop door chimed, and Mr. Wilson walked in, looking different from the angry man in the park. He seemed smaller somehow, more human in his casual weekend clothes. He ordered his coffee and made his way to Michael's table, the weight of their last encounter visible in his careful movements. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Mr. Wilson said as he sat down. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, a gesture that seemed more about having something to hold onto than wanting to drink. "I spent this whole week thinking about what happened, about what I did." Michael nodded, taking a sip of his tea. "How's Andy doing?" The mention of his son brought a mix of emotions to Mr. Wilson's face. He's teaching me things I should have already known. Yesterday, he came home from school and told me about his new friend Lee, who shared lunch with him when he forgot his. He said, "See, Dad, kind people are everywhere. Kids they just see people, don't they?" "They do," Michael agreed. "Until we teach them not to." Mr. Wilson winced at the truth in those words. "I've been trying to understand why I reacted the way I did. I've always thought of myself as not prejudiced. I have colleagues of different backgrounds. I teach Andy to be kind to everyone. But when I saw you with him," he trailed off, struggling with the admission. "It's easier to believe we're better than our instincts," Michael said quietly. "Until those instincts take over in a moment of fear." "The thing is," Mr. Wilson continued, his voice thick with emotion, "I keep thinking about what could have happened if you hadn't helped Andy. If you had walked past him, like so many people probably did, because you were afraid of exactly what I did to you. My son could have been actually lost, actually in danger, because of the kind of fear and prejudice I showed." Outside the coffee shop window, people walked past, parents with children, teenagers on skateboards, elderly couples holding hands. Each person carrying their own stories, their own prejudices, their own potential for change. "You know what really got to me?" Mr. Wilson said, finally taking a sip of his cooling coffee. "When I watched that video that's been going around, I saw myself from the outside. I saw how my actions affected not just you and Andy, but everyone watching. All those kids in the park, learning that helping others might be punished. All those people who look like you, being reminded that no good deed goes unpunished." Michael leaned forward slightly. "That's why I agreed to meet today. Because you're willing to see it, to talk about it. That's where change starts." Andy asks about you, Mr. Wilson admitted with a small smile. He wants to know if you're really going to make that space dinosaur game. He drew a picture of what he thinks it should look like. A T-Rex in an astronaut suit. They both laughed, the tension easing slightly. Well, I actually mentioned it at work, Michael said. Our educational games team thought it was an interesting idea. Who knows? Maybe something good will come from that day in more ways than one. I've been talking to other parents, Mr. Wilson said, about what happened, about how we teach our kids about stranger danger without teaching them to fear everyone who's different from us, about how to balance safety with humanity. It's not easy, but it's necessary. A young family walked past their table, a little girl holding both her parents' hands, swinging between them. Both men watched them pass, thinking about how simple things looked through a child's eyes. My mother used to tell me something, Michael said, watching the family through the window. She said that courage isn't just about doing big, heroic things. Sometimes it's about doing the right thing in small moments, even when it would be easier not to. Even when you might be misunderstood. Mr. Wilson nodded slowly. I want to be better, he said simply. For Andy, for myself, for everyone who's ever been in your position, just trying to help and being met with suspicion instead of gratitude. The sun was setting over Cedar Park, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. As Michael finally resumed his interrupted walk, he reflected on how a simple act of kindness had turned into something much more significant. Sometimes the hardest moments led to the most important conversations, and maybe, just maybe, this afternoon would create ripples of change beyond what any of them could see. As the police officers finished their report, the atmosphere in the park had shifted dramatically. The evening light was turning golden, casting a gentle glow over the scene that had just unfolded. Officer Thompson approached Michael one last time, her expression softened with professional respect. Mr. Chen, you're free to go. Thank you for your patience throughout this situation. She handed him her card. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to contact me. Her words carried a weight of understanding. They both knew this kind of incident happened far too often. Andy, who had been quietly holding Ms. Rebecca's hand, suddenly broke free and ran to Michael before anyone could stop him. Are you going to leave now? His voice trembled slightly, blue eyes wide with concern. I didn't get to say thank you properly. Michael knelt down to Andy's level one last time, conscious of Mr. Wilson watching them. You're very welcome, buddy. Promise me you'll be more careful about wandering off, okay? Even beautiful butterflies aren't worth getting lost over. I promise, Andy said solemnly, then surprised everyone by giving Michael a quick hug. Will you still make that space game with dinosaurs in it? Michael couldn't help but laugh, the tension of the afternoon breaking slightly. Well, I'll definitely suggest it to my team now. Dinosaurs in space could be pretty cool, right? Mr. Wilson stepped forward, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. The anger was gone, replaced by something that looked like a mixture of shame and realization. He cleared his throat awkwardly, clearly struggling to find the right words. Mr. Chen, he began, his voice hoarse. I owe you an apology, a big one. He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of distress. I jumped to conclusions. Horrible, unfair conclusions. And instead of thanking you for helping my son, He trailed off, the weight of his actions clearly hitting him. Michael stood up slowly, maintaining the calm dignity he'd shown throughout the ordeal. I understand you were scared for your son, he said quietly. Any parent would be. But maybe this can be a moment for all of us to think about why you assumed the worst when you saw me with Andy. Ms. Rebecca stepped forward, still holding Andy's backpack. Mr. Wilson, if I may, when I couldn't find Andy, I was terrified. But Mr. Chen did exactly what we teach children. He stayed in a public place, contacted authorities, and kept Andy safe. We're lucky he was the one who found him. Officer Lopez, who had remained to finish her report, added her perspective. In my 15 years working park security, I've seen many lost children. Mr. Chen's handling of the situation was textbook perfect. He even made sure to keep his hands visible and maintain appropriate distance until authorities arrived. Mr. Wilson looked at his son, who was still standing near Michael, then back at Michael himself. My behavior, it wasn't just about being a worried father, was it? I need to face that truth. His voice cracked slightly. I saw you with my son, and I didn't see a kind person helping a lost child. I saw what my prejudices wanted me to see. The playground had grown quieter as the evening approached, the earlier chaos of the day fading into a gentle calm. A few families remained, pushing children on swings or gathering belongings to head home, unaware of the profound moment unfolding nearby. "Dad," Andy said suddenly, tugging at his father's jacket. "Mr. Michael told me that his mom says everything feels better with a full stomach. Maybe we could all get ice cream. You always say ice cream helps you think better." The simple wisdom of a child cut through the tension, bringing surprised smiles to the adults' faces. Mr. Wilson looked at his son with a mixture of love and regret, recognizing how his actions had affected Andy's understanding of the world. "Actually," Mr. Wilson said slowly, looking at Michael, "if you're willing, Mr. Chen, I'd like to have a real conversation. Not here, not now, you've been through enough today. But maybe we could meet for coffee sometime. I have a lot to learn, and, well, I'd like to start by listening." Michael considered the offer, noting the genuine remorse in Mr. Wilson's eyes. "I'd like that," he said finally. "Change has to start somewhere, right?" As the group began to disperse, Officers Thompson and Rivera to their patrol car, Officer Lopez to the security office, and Ms. Rebecca gathering her things, Andy gave Michael one last wave. "Don't forget about the space dinosaurs," he called out, bringing a smile to everyone's faces. Ms. Rebecca stepped closer to Mr. Wilson. "Sir, I'm so sorry Andy got lost on my watch. But Mr. Chen is the reason Andy was found safely. Your son is smart. He trusted him because Mr. Chen was kind and careful. He didn't try to hide anything or take Andy anywhere." They sat right there, in front of everyone, waiting for help. Officer Thompson had finished reviewing the security footage on Officer Lopez's tablet. The video clearly showed Michael's interactions with Andy, all in plain sight and by the book. She walked over to her partner and Mr. Wilson, speaking in a firm but professional tone. "Mr. Wilson, based on all available evidence, Mr. Chen acted as a good Samaritan, following every proper procedure for helping a lost child. There was no attempted kidnapping. In fact, he likely prevented what could have been a much more serious situation by keeping your son safe until authorities arrived." The weight of his mistake was finally beginning to show on Mr. Wilson's face. His shoulders slumped, and the anger drained away, replaced by a complex mix of relief, embarrassment, and regret. He looked at his son, still standing bravely by Michael's side, and then at Michael himself, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park as the situation began to de-escalate. But the impact of these moments would linger long after the police cars drove away, leaving everyone involved to grapple with hard truths about prejudice, judgment, and the courage it takes to do the right thing, even when facing unfair suspicion. The police cruisers pulled up to the park entrance with their lights flashing but sirens off. Two officers stepped out, a tall woman with graying hair in a neat bun and her younger male partner. They approached the tense group with measured steps, taking in the scene. A crying child, an agitated father, a distressed babysitter, and Michael, who remained perfectly still with his hands visible. The female officer, whose badge read Officer Thompson, spoke first. "I'm Officer Thompson, and this is Officer Rivera. We received a call about a possible attempted kidnapping." Her tone was professional but not accusatory, her experienced eyes scanning each person's body language. Mr. Wilson immediately stepped forward, still keeping himself between Andy and Michael. "Yes, this man had my son. Ms. Rebecca called me because Andy was missing, and when I got here, this stranger was walking away with him." "That's not true," Andy shouted through his tears, trying to push past his father. "Mr. Michael found me when I was scared. He helped me." His small voice cracked with emotion, and Ms. Rebecca put a comforting hand on his shoulder. Officer Rivera had moved slightly to the side, creating space between Michael and the others while his partner gathered information. "Sir," he addressed Michael, "could you please explain your version of events?" Michael kept his voice steady and clear. "I was taking my usual weekend walk in the park when I found Andy crying behind a tree near the playground. He was lost and scared. I stayed in plain sight, sat with him on a public bench, and immediately called park security." He gestured to Officer Lopez. Everything was documented. Officer Lopez stepped forward, holding up her radio. "That's correct, officers. Mr. Chen contacted us at 3:42 p.m. We have the recorded call and his full cooperation logged. He followed all proper protocols for assisting a lost child. Officer Thompson nodded, taking notes. Ms. Rebecca, you were watching Andy today. The babysitter twisted her hands nervously. Yes, I've been Andy's babysitter for 2 years. He wandered off while chasing a butterfly. It was only a few minutes, but when I couldn't find him, I panicked and called Mr. Wilson. She looked at Michael apologetically. I'm so grateful someone kind found him instead of, well, someone with bad intentions. Dad, please listen. Andy had finally broken free from his father's grip and ran to stand in front of Michael. Mr. Michael told me about his job making computer games about space and dinosaurs. He gave me his water bottle because I was thirsty, and he helped me not be scared. The boy's fierce defense, delivered through hiccups and tears, created a moment of stunned silence. Officer Rivera exchanged a look with his partner. They'd seen many situations like this before, but the child's passionate defense was telling. Mr. Wilson, could you step over here with me for a moment? He gestured a few feet away, giving Officer Thompson space to continue her investigation. As Rivera spoke quietly with Mr. Wilson, Thompson turned to Michael. Do you have any identification with you, sir? Yes, in my wallet. Michael slowly reached for his back pocket, maintaining clear movements. He produced his driver's license and his company ID badge from the tech firm where he worked. I also have the call log on my phone showing when I contacted Park Security. Officer Thompson examined the IDs and handed them back. Mr. Chen, why didn't you just walk away when you saw a crying child? Many people would have, especially given how this situation has developed. Michael's answer was quiet but firm, because it wasn't right. I saw a scared little boy who needed help, and I couldn't just walk past. I have a nephew his age. I would want someone to help him if he was lost and afraid. Meanwhile, Officer Rivera was having an intense conversation with Mr. Wilson. Sir, think about what you're alleging here. We have security footage of the park, a documented call to Park Security, multiple witnesses, and your own son's testimony. Mr. Chen did everything by the book to help your lost child. Mr. Wilson's face had begun to shift from anger to something else, perhaps the first hints of shame. He watched as Andy continued to stand protectively near Michael, his small face set in determination despite his tears. Officer Lopez maintained her calm demeanor, though her expression had hardened. Mr. Wilson, I need you to understand that Mr. Chen followed all proper protocols. He stayed in a public place, contacted security immediately, and waited for authorized personnel to arrive. Your son was never in any danger. But Mr. Wilson was already speaking into his phone, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Yes, I'm at Cedar Park. A man tried to take my son. No, we have him here. Yes, Park Security is here, but I want the police. My son was missing for almost an hour. Michael stood perfectly still, his heart heavy but his expression composed. He'd done the right thing, and he knew it, but that knowledge didn't make this moment any easier. He could see the fear and confusion on Andy's face, the embarrassment on Ms. Rebecca's, and the growing concern on Officer Lopez. The beautiful autumn afternoon that had started with a simple act of kindness was about to become much more complicated. As they waited for the police to arrive, Michael couldn't help but wonder how many other people would hesitate to help a lost child in the future, fearing exactly this kind of response. The sound of distant sirens began to grow louder, and Michael took a deep breath, preparing himself for what was to come. Sometimes doing the right thing meant facing unfair consequences, but he wouldn't have walked past that crying child even if he'd known how this would end. The afternoon was growing cooler when a park security officer in a green uniform approached their bench. Andy instinctively moved closer to Michael, showing how much trust had built between them in the short time they'd spent together. Hi there, the officer said with a kind smile, crouching down to Andy's level. Her name tag read, Officer Lopez. You must be Andy. We've got quite a few people looking for you, young man. She glanced at Michael with a professional nod. And you're Mr. Chen? Michael nodded, keeping his manner open and calm for Andy's sake. Yes, we've been waiting here together. Andy's been telling me all about dinosaurs while we waited. He smiled encouragingly at the boy, who was looking nervously between him and Officer Lopez. Ms. Rebecca is really worried about you, Andy. Officer Lopez said gently. She's been searching all over the park. Would you like to walk with Mr. Chen and me to find her? She understood instinctively that Andy had grown to trust Michael, and separating them immediately might upset the boy. Andy nodded, standing up but staying close to Michael. As they began walking, Officer Lopez radioed in their location and movement. The three of them made their way toward the park's main pathway, with Andy between them, still clutching his dinosaur backpack. Can you tell me more about that butterfly you saw? Officer Lopez asked, keeping the conversation light as they walked. I've seen some beautiful ones in the garden near the park entrance. Andy's face lit up as he described the blue and black butterfly again, his small steps becoming more confident. Michael listened with a smile, relieved that help had arrived and that Andy was handling the situation so well. They hadn't gone far when they heard a woman's voice calling out frantically, "Andy, Andy." A woman in a blue flowered shirt came running around the corner of the path, her face flushed from searching. "Ms. Rebecca," Andy called back, his whole body relaxing at the sight of his familiar babysitter. She rushed toward them, tears of relief in her eyes. But before she could reach Andy, another figure burst onto the scene. A man in an expensive-looking jacket came sprinting up behind Ms. Rebecca, his face red with exertion and something else, anger. This had to be Andy's father, but the look on his face made Michael's stomach drop. "Get away from my son," the man shouted, pushing past Ms. Rebecca and rushing forward. His face was contorted with rage and fear as he grabbed Andy's arm, roughly pulling him away from Michael and Officer Lopez. "Daddy, no," Andy protested, trying to pull away from his father's tight grip. "Mr. Michael helped me. He gave me a granola bar and told me about space games." But Andy's father wasn't listening. He pushed Andy behind him, pointing an accusing finger at Michael. "What were you doing with my son?" he demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "Ms. Rebecca called me in hysterics because she couldn't find him, and I find him with you." Officer Lopez stepped forward, her stance professional but firm. "Sir, please calm down. Mr. Chen found your son when he was lost and immediately contacted park security. We have everything documented." "I'm calling the police," Andy's father interrupted, pulling out his phone with trembling hands. "He was trying to take my son." Michael felt his heart racing, but he kept his voice steady and his hands visible. Years of dealing with prejudice had taught him how to handle these situations, even though each one hurt just as much as the first. "Sir, I understand you were worried about Andy. I would be too, but I only wanted to help him find his way back safely." Ms. Rebecca tried to intervene, her voice shaking. "Mr. Wilson, please listen. When I realized Andy was missing, I started searching immediately. The park security told me they had located him with a kind man ho." "Kind." Mr. Wilson scoffed, already dialing 911. "You let my son wander off, and now you're defending this stranger who tried to take him." Andy started crying again, clutching Ms. Rebecca's hand. "Daddy, you're being mean. Mr. Michael helped me. He let me have water and told me about dinosaurs and space." Michael smiled, grateful for the distraction. "That's where I work. I help make computer games that teach kids about science and math." This wasn't strictly true. He worked on educational software platforms, but he knew it would be more relatable for a 6-year-old. Andy's eyes widened with interest. "Really? Like with dinosaurs and stuff?" "Sometimes," Michael chuckled. "Right now we're working on one about space exploration. Would you like to hear about it?" As Michael described a simplified version of his current project, he could see Andy becoming more animated, asking questions and even giggling at some of Michael's silly space jokes. The fear that had been so prominent in his eyes was fading, replaced by genuine interest and trust. The sun had shifted position slightly, and more parents and children were filling the playground area. Michael knew that somewhere in the park, people were probably searching frantically for Andy. But for now, his job was to keep this scared little boy feeling safe and calm until help arrived. What Michael didn't know was that the next few minutes would test everything: his patience, his dignity, and society's deepest prejudices. The simple act of helping a lost child was about to become far more complicated than he could have imagined, but for now, he focused on Andy's animated description of his favorite dinosaur facts, knowing that these peaceful moments were precious. As Michael and Andy sat on the bench, The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the playground. The initial tension in Andy's small frame began to ease, though he still clutched his dinosaur-decorated backpack like a shield. Michael knew he needed to help the boy feel more comfortable while they waited for help. "You know," Michael said softly, reaching into his gym bag, "I always carry a couple of snacks with me on my walks. Would you like a granola bar?" He pulled out an unopened bar, still in its wrapper, and held it where Andy could clearly see it. "My mom always told me that everything feels a little better with a full stomach." Andy looked at the granola bar, then at Michael, his young mind clearly working through the stranger danger rules he'd been taught. After a moment's hesitation, he gave a small nod. Michael placed the bar on the bench between them, letting Andy pick it up himself. "Thank you," Andy whispered, carefully unwrapping the bar. His hands had stopped shaking now, and some color was returning to his pale cheeks. "I like the chocolate chip ones." "Me too," Michael smiled, pulling out his water bottle. "Would you like some water? It's still cold." He demonstrated by taking a sip first, then offered it to Andy, who accepted it with slightly sticky fingers from the granola bar. As Andy ate, Michael gently began asking questions that might help them find Ms. Rebecca. "Can you tell me more about the butterfly you were following? Which direction did it go?" Andy's eyes lit up slightly at the memory, despite his current situation. "It was blue and black, really pretty. I've never seen one like that before. It went that way." He pointed toward a flower garden near the park's entrance, and I followed it past the big trees. Then when I looked back, I couldn't see Ms. Rebecca anymore. Michael nodded understanding. "That sounds like a swallowtail butterfly. They're beautiful, aren't they? I used to chase them too when I was your age." He paused, noticing how Andy relaxed a bit more at this shared experience. "Do you remember passing any special buildings or benches while you were following it?" Andy furrowed his brow in concentration. "There was a green building with a drinking fountain, and then some really tall flowers." His voice grew more confident as the memories came back. "That's really helpful," Michael encouraged. "The green building is the park office. That means we know exactly where you walked." He noticed Andy shiver slightly in the cooling afternoon air and wished he had a jacket to offer. "Would you like to tell me about your cool dinosaur shirt while we think about what to do next?" Andy's face brightened noticeably. "It's a velociraptor. Did you know they had feathers? My teacher said they were really smart, like dolphins." His enthusiasm for dinosaurs momentarily overshadowed his worry. As Andy chatted about his favorite dinosaurs, Michael discreetly kept an eye on their surroundings, looking for anyone who might be searching for a lost child. He also pulled out his phone, ready to contact the park security office, but kept it visible so Andy wouldn't feel scared. "Andy, I think we should let the park security know we're here. They can help us find Ms. Rebecca faster. Would that be okay?" Michael made sure to include Andy in the decision, wanting him to feel some control over the situation. Andy considered this, playing with the wrapper of his finished granola bar. "Will they call the police? Am I in trouble?" His voice quivered slightly. "No, buddy, you're not in trouble at all," Michael assured him. "The park security just wants to help, like I do. They're kind of like the park's helpers. They make sure everyone is safe and having fun." He kept his voice calm and steady, noting how Andy's shoulders relaxed at his words. "Okay," Andy agreed, scooting a tiny bit closer to Michael on the bench. The trust was building slowly but surely. Michael dialed the park security office number he found online. "Hi, this is Michael Chen. I'm at Cedar Park near the main playground, and I've found a lost child." He kept his voice cheerful and matter-of-fact, not wanting to frighten Andy further. The security officer on the other end was professional and efficient, taking down their location and Michael's description of both himself and Andy. They assured him someone would be there shortly to help. While they waited, Andy's curiosity seemed to overcome his shyness. "What's that on your shirt?" he asked, pointing to the logo on Michael's tech company t-shirt. The story was just beginning, and the peaceful autumn afternoon at Cedar Park was about to become much more eventful than anyone could have anticipated. The autumn breeze rustled through the maple trees at Cedar Park that Saturday afternoon. The playground was alive with the usual weekend buzz, children swinging, sliding, and chasing each other while parents chatted on nearby benches. Among the everyday scene, Michael Chen, a software engineer who lived in the neighborhood, was taking his usual afternoon walk. At 35, Michael had the kind of face that made people feel at ease, warm brown eyes behind stylish glasses and a gentle smile that came naturally to him. He just finished a long week of coding and meetings, and these weekend walks were his way of clearing his head. The familiar sounds of children playing brought back memories of his own childhood, when he'd spend hours at parks just like this one. But something caught his attention, a sound that stood out from the usual playground chaos. Between the squeaking swings and playful shouts, he heard sniffling. Michael slowed his pace, looking around until he spotted the source. A small boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, huddled behind a large oak tree at the edge of the playground. The boy wore a bright green dinosaur t-shirt that was slightly dirty from playing, and his light-up sneakers were covered in wood chips from the playground. His face was red and streaked with tears, his small shoulders shaking as he tried to hold back sobs. Michael's heart immediately went out to him. The boy looked absolutely terrified. For a moment, Michael hesitated. In today's world, he knew all too well how it might look, a man approaching a crying child. As an Asian American, he'd faced his share of prejudice, and he knew that even good intentions could be misinterpreted. But he couldn't just walk away from a child in distress. Moving slowly and deliberately, Michael approached the tree. He made sure to stay a comfortable distance away and knelt down to appear less intimidating. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly, his voice gentle and calm. "Are you okay? You seem pretty upset." The boy looked up, startled, his blue eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. He clutched his small backpack tighter to his chest, but didn't run away. Through hiccupping sobs, he managed to shake his head no. "My name's Michael," he continued, keeping his voice steady and warm. "I live right near this park. Would you like to tell me what's wrong? Maybe I can help." He remained where he was, letting the boy decide whether to trust him. The child wiped his nose with his sleeve, looking around nervously before speaking. I can't find Ms. Rebecca," he whispered, his voice trembling. "She was watching me while Mom's at work, and I saw this really pretty butterfly, and I followed it, and now I don't know where I am." Michael's expression softened with understanding. The boy had done what so many children do, followed his curiosity without thinking about the consequences. Now he was scared and lost, and Michael could see the panic starting to build in his eyes again. "That sounds really scary," Michael acknowledged, pulling a clean tissue from his pocket and offering it to the boy. "What's your name? And do you remember what Ms. Rebecca was wearing today?" The boy took the tissue cautiously. "I'm Andy," he said, his voice a little stronger now. "Ms. Rebecca had on a blue shirt with flowers. She was sitting on a bench near the big red slide." He pointed vaguely in a direction, but his uncertainty was clear in his gesture. Michael nodded encouragingly. "That's really helpful, Andy. You're doing great. Would you like to sit on that bench over there with me? It's right where everyone can see us, and we can look for Ms. Rebecca together. I bet she's very worried and looking for you too." Andy looked at the bench Michael pointed to. It was in clear view of the playground, where other families were still playing. After a moment's consideration, he gave a small nod. His survival instincts were clearly working. Stay where people can see you, don't go anywhere private with strangers, but he also seemed to sense that Michael genuinely wanted to help. As they walked the short distance to the bench, Michael noticed how Andy kept a careful distance between them, occasionally glancing up at him with a mix of wariness and hope. It was a delicate balance, being helpful while respecting the child's space and making sure he felt safe. Michael knew these first few minutes were crucial in building the trust needed to help Andy find his way back to his caregiver. Little did Michael know that this simple act of kindness was about to spiral into something much more complicated. For now, though, he focused on the task at hand, helping a scared little boy find his way back to safety. As they settled on the bench, Michael could see Andy's shoulders starting to relax slightly, the initial panic in his eyes beginning to fade. It was a small victory, but an important one.